Silent Hill: Shattered Memories for the Nintendo Wii is a standout experience, not just among the group of Western-developed Silent Hill games, but the franchise as a whole. Its innovative, if flawed use of the Wii's motion controls, and an interestingly unique approach to its gameplay and story make it an entry in the venerated horror series that deserves to be experienced by more people. This is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to a special Hallo-Wii-N episode of Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not widely considered classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. Silent Hill: Shattered Memories was designed by Climax Studios for Konami, modern Konami that is. This was during the period in the late 2000s when Japanese developers like Konami contracted out their longtime properties to Western studios, otherwise known as the Inafune approach. Climax has a long history, including developing the PS1 versions of Warcraft 2 and Diablo, as well as the Xbox version of Tron 2.0 Killer App, a game I definitely want to return to in a future video. They would release two entries in the Silent Hill franchise: Silent Hill Origins for the PSP and PS2, and, as a follow-up, Silent Hill: Shattered Memories. Shattered Memories released for the Wii in 2009 in North America, and 2010 in Japan and PAL territories, and would see a port to the PS2 and PSP in all territories in 2010. Tom Hewlett, producer of the game, recently stated on Twitter, however, that the game was designed specifically with the Wii in mind, and that is the best way to experience it. And he's not wrong. The game is, well, it's not a remake of the first game because it skews too far afield of the original experience, but it's not a reboot either because it is its own standalone thing. It's more of a reimagining of the original PS1 game, in which Harry Mason wanders the town of Silent Hill searching for his daughter Cheryl after a car accident separates them. That premise, and some of the character names, are about all Shattered Memories has in common with the original Silent Hill. Yeah, there's a Dahlia, Lisa, and Sybil Bennett, but they're all radically different from what came before. The ubiquitous fog the series is known for is gone, and not in an HD collection sort of way either. Instead, it's been replaced by a heavy blizzard, which I'm okay with. Now the weather, rather than just obscuring, feels like a threat in and of itself. Tied to that, the Nightmare Realm is not made up of rusted metal, but instead is covered in thick sheets of ice, which nicely plays into the narrative and theme. In addition to all of this, the gameplay is significantly different from what came before as well. For one thing, while Shattered Memories is a horror game, it is not a survival horror game. The player is not given an inventory, limited or otherwise. Instead, locked doors usually have keys hidden in the same room, puzzles are not esoteric and will have an immediate effect on the environment when solved, and the only pickups Harry finds throughout the game are mementos and keepsakes. But more on those in a bit. Harry moves around similarly to the Rookie and Ghostbusters discussed in the previous video. The thumbstick on the nunchuck controls his actual movement, while the Wiimote controls his line of sight, and, by extension, his flashlight, which allows his line of sight to mean anything in the predominantly dark environments he finds himself in. The environments plainly indicate what can and can't be interacted with. Sort of. See, in terms of actually manipulating physical objects in the environment, the game clearly points out what is and is not allowed. There is another, less obvious way that Harry can interact with his environs, however, and it is quite possibly one of the coolest innovations in the game. Harry has a smartphone which he carries through the game. This smartphone, which is totally, definitely not an iPhone TM, acts as an in-game menu, allowing the player to save, access previously received or seen messages, and access the game's map. It also has other functions one would expect from a smartphone though. For one, it takes photos and stores them on the phone itself. This mechanic is used as a form of collectible hunting, as there are hidden scenes that can only be detected when photographed. Which, saying it out loud, kinda sounds like it's paying homage not to Silent Hill, but Fatal Frame, which is pretty cool in and of itself. Also, let's just stop for a moment to remember that the iPhone only popularized smartphones 2 years prior, so having it appear and immediately feel familiar here is really impressive. Harry's smartphone has one more key function though. It's, well, a phone. Not only will you receive voicemail messages which play into the overall plot of the game, but there are phone numbers strewn throughout the environments as well, and all of them work. Seriously, I tried every number I came across. Well, every one I came across once I knew the phone was a thing, and every single one of them worked and either served to world build, provide clues for puzzles, or were just a nice bit of levity in an otherwise oppressive environment. The coolest part about this mechanic, though, isn't just that the numbers all work, but also how you hear the calls. The game utilizes the gyro sensor and speaker built into the Wiimote so that the player has to bring the Wiimote up to their ear just like a real phone. I found that the calls were a bit loud, so I held the Wiimote a few inches away from my head, but the tactile sensation of hearing the phone ring after dialing the number and doing what I've been conditioned to do with an actual phone and having it work that way was kinda mind-blowing. That's not the only area where the motion controls were used in clever ways either. You know those physical interactions with the environment or objects I mentioned earlier? Once you get in close, you use the A and B buttons in a pinching or grabbing fashion to grasp objects, which you then move around using the Wii's motion controls. This allows for all sorts of interactions I wasn't entirely prepared for, like rolling down a window or turning a radio knob, or controlling both the flow and temperature of water from a faucet. All of this doesn't even mention the throwing motions the player uses when a monster latches onto Harry in the nightmare sequences, or the swimming sequence where the player literally uses both the Wiimote and nunchuck to swim forward as though they are actually swimming. All of this with nary a waggle in sight. That's not to say these controls are perfect, however. For one thing, when examining the mementos that Harry finds throughout the town, the game expects the player to rotate the Wiimote 360 degrees on the X, Y, and Z axes to be able to see small details, as well as pressing the B button on the underside of the Wiimote to zoom in. This gets awkward, especially since the nunchuck is still attached to the Wiimote, so the cord hinders movement, and trying to press B when you've got the Wiimote in a weird position isn't great. As well, when interacting with objects, it's sometimes not entirely clear what can and cannot be directly manipulated. For example, with that faucet, it took me a good 10 minutes to realize that the water flow and the water temperature were separate objects to be manipulated. I kept turning the water on and off on the 3 faucets, thinking it was a combination puzzle, and I just didn't have the right sequence. Then there are the obstacles in the nightmare sequences. The player can topple these behind them to try to slow down the pursuing monsters, which, in theory, sounds like a cool and workable design. In practice, however, I got it to work a grand total of 3 times. The rest of the times I tried, the motion it was asking for caused my Wiimote to not be recognized by the sensor bar. I don't know if that's an issue with the game or my hardware setup, but I didn't have that issue with Ghostbusters, so I just stopped trying to knock stuff over. You might have noticed that I haven't really discussed the combat in the game. Well, that's because there isn't any. Don't get the wrong idea though, that's not a bad thing. For all the talk of the original Harry Mason or James Sunderland being an everyman who isn't trained for combat, it's kinda telling that the first item they get is a weapon of some sort. I know that if I see a horde of monsters rushing at me, my first response is, pfft, I can take them, and not to run for my life. Nope, not at all. Seriously, anyone who thinks like that is more likely to be the first to die in a monster movie. That's why here, the closest things Harry gets to a weapon against said horde of monsters is knocking stuff over or a road flare to keep them at bay. In that regard, it's fitting that the sequences in which the monsters come after Harry and the player are called nightmare sequences, because that's what they feel like. The game pushes the player to run as fast as they can, as frantically as they can, without being able to stop and focus, because they are being relentlessly chased by overwhelming odds. That tension is heightened by the fact that escaping the monsters isn't the only goal in these sequences. I learned that the hard way. After the introductory nightmare sequence, which pretty much was a straight line, I figured that's how it would be throughout the game. Nope. I wound up running in circles before realizing that the relatively open-ended areas in the town proper also applied to the nightmare realm, and that I actually needed to keep track of where I was going. That's where the fear really comes in for the nightmare sequences, because not only does the game push you to run away as quickly as you can, but sometimes the player is forced to run through groups of monsters to get to your objective. When that happens, the only defenses are the flare mentioned earlier, or just throwing the monsters off your back, which becomes exponentially more difficult when more and more of them pile on. It creates the sort of panic tension that all of the other games, aside from maybe PT, rest in peace, simply weren't able to achieve because they offered a way to beat back the assault. There's another aspect of these sequences that ties into the larger ideas and narrative of the game in that there's a psychological layer and meaning to why they're here and take the form they do. In order to discuss that, however, let's talk about how the game psychologically profiles the player as well. So, as a framing device for the game's narrative, the game intermittently places the player in a first-person perspective in psychologist Dr. K's office. Here, the quote-unquote good doctor will discuss concepts with you and have you engage in exercises in order to profile you. By you, I mean the player. What the game is doing is using these tests to cater the experience to the individual player. Some of these customizations are fairly transparent. For example, the house that Harry thinks he lives at near the beginning of the game is given the same color scheme as the coloring book picture the player is tasked with filling in during the Dr. K sequence just before. Considering the name of the picture is Happy Family, it's not hard to see that what the game is actually doing is setting up the house to be more inviting for the individual player. That way, when it's revealed that it is not Harry's home, the idea of a happy family residence feels like more of a betrayal. Something that ties into the big twist at the end of the game. There are others as well, like having a puzzle located in either the art studio or planetarium in the high school, depending on whether the player leans towards more arts or sciences classes in the prior Dr. K exercise. Then there are some weird, glaring instances of the game not quite getting it right though. The main example is Sybil Bennett. Sybil plays a similar role to her appearance in the original Silent Hill. She's a cop just trying to figure out what's going on and help Harry out. Now, depending on the answers to Dr. K's questionnaire just before encountering her, her appearance will take one of three forms. For my playthrough, I got the version that most resembles her character from the PS1 game. Or at least the sexy Halloween costume version of her. Honestly, it was jarring encountering her like that, not only for the overt male gaze catering going on here, but because, in the middle of trying to build a believable world about a town snowed in by a heavy blizzard, I'm expected to accept that Sybil would be running around not only without a coat, but with her top half unbuttoned? And no, I'm not showing how I answered in order to get that version of Sybil. Thank you very much. That's because, when you finish the game, it presents a psychological profile during the credits that illustrates how the game sees you based on the results of the exercises throughout. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little disconcerted by how accurate the profile was, for the most part. There are little things that got wrong, but it was largely on the money. Although, huge shout out to whoever decided that my answers meant I was lousy in bed. Thanks a lot. Not that I entirely trust Dr. K's assessment, mind you. The manual says that Dr. K's office is a safe place, but it really isn't. I'm not sure a safe place entails a therapist playing a game called Sleeping or Dead, in which the patient has to decide whether a series of photos is comprised of sleeping people or dead bodies, before revealing that they're all dead bodies. I'm also pretty sure that drinking scotch during sessions is frowned upon, or throwing glasses of scotch against walls so that they shatter, or yelling at their patient, or you get the idea. The manual even contradicts the whole safe place notion with Dr. K's bio, which states that a cynical glimmer behind his eyes suggests there's more on his mind than he's willing to share. Yeah, I bet there is. Psychologically profiling the player is only half the story with the Dr. K sessions though. Okay, massive spoilers for the ending here, so consider yourself duly warned. Also, strap in because this is literally my area of expertise. While the framing device of Dr. K's office may seem like just a reason to profile the player, these sessions also actually play into the overall narrative. During the last of these sessions, it's revealed that Harry Mason has been dead for the past 18 years, and the player is actually in the role of Cheryl Mason, who has never come to terms with her parents' divorce and Harry's subsequent death. Because of this, Cheryl has adopted a Harry persona as a way of keeping him alive. I actually had this particular twist spoiled for me going into the game, and as a result, I was able to pick up on a lot of the subtle cues that this was what was actually going on. For one, all of the frozen memories that Harry unlocks in order to properly escape from the nightmare sequences are Cheryl's. It's her trip to the cabin in the forest where she tries to avoid being pressured by the boy she's with. It's her experiences with being shamed and bullied during high school. It's her memories in the mall and her mom's reaction to how her dad treats her. The mementos and keepsakes Harry finds throughout the town play a similar role. All of them tie into memories Cheryl is either repressing or simply refusing to acknowledge. Even the nightmare structure itself is indicative of this underlying thread. Having nightmares about being chased can indicate trying to avoid something unpleasant and traumatic in waking life. I'd definitely say regressing into Harry's personality to avoid dealing with his death qualifies. The other interesting thing about this dynamic is that it casts Dahlia's characterization into heavy doubt. Dahlia, who was Alyssa's and therefore Cheryl's mother in PS1 Silent Hill, is still Cheryl's mother here. She's just married to Harry. Or, was, I guess? Throughout the game, Dahlia is depicted by turns as alcohol-dependent, sex-driven, uncaring, and self-destructive. However, since this is Cheryl's perception of her, this depiction can safely be called unreliable, especially when Dr. K throws it into doubt. Essentially, Cheryl blames Dahlia for the divorce, which she thinks then led to Harry's death. And since the living parent can't possibly hope to compete with the perfect dead parent, she must be a wreck, right? Oh, and there is definitely something eatable going on with this scene, though. I mean, if Harry is actually Cheryl and Dahlia is Cheryl's mother, yeah, this is awkward. Well, okay, Cheryl seemingly doesn't just blame Dahlia for the divorce and Harry's death. According to Dr. K's assessment, part of the reason for Cheryl's current condition is because she blames herself for everything that happened as well. Dr. K alludes to this in an earlier session when he talks about guilt and blame, and these themes have long been a core part of the Silent Hill series' focus. Here, though, the guilt isn't because Cheryl murdered someone, or multiple people. It's survivor's guilt for outliving Harry, possibly mixed with guilt over not being true to herself. I say that because there seems to be something more going on here as well. Now, keep in mind that I'm a cis-het white male 18 to 45, so I cannot speak from first-hand experience, but I was definitely picking up queer undertones to the game. Those frozen memories I just mentioned, all of them can easily be read as Cheryl trying to deal with not being heteronormative in a small Midwestern American town. There's also the fact that Cheryl, as Harry, is only attracted to women throughout the game. See the potential sexy versions of both Sybil and Michelle. In fact, no matter how the player answers, Michelle presents as a sort of idealized girlfriend figure, either as prom queen or lounge singer in a red dress. No matter what changes the female characters take, there is a certain attractiveness to be found, especially since the only male characters in the game other than Harry are Dr. K, John, Michelle's boyfriend who breaks up with her, and the older man in Harry's house. More than that, Helen Kennedy's notion of genderqueer play, discussed in the Resident Evil 3 vs. Silent Hill video, not only applies here, but is doubled. Quick refresher. Kennedy argues in her article that, with male players opting to play as Lara Croft, there is the potential to consider that a form of genderqueer play. Problematic, yes, but genderqueer nonetheless. Not only is the player taking on the role of Harry, but they are taking on the role of Cheryl taking on the role of Harry. In other words, no matter what, there is some gender crossover going on here. Dr. K also hints at this possibility when discussing sex and sexuality. During the exercise about sexual versus non-sexual images, he talks about how Cheryl is denying herself sex, and that she would be healthier if she just acknowledged her sex drive. Then, when the twist is revealed, he refers to her quote-unquote abnormal sexuality, the guilt she feels, and how she's lived 18 years in denial. Admittedly, the quote-unquote abnormal sexuality could be referring to the thing with Dahlia mentioned earlier, but taken as a whole, it does seem like the game is subtly hinting at Cheryl's queerness without explicitly stating it, because, well, toxic gamer bros. Given all of this, the Silent Hill in this game is literally Robin Wood's American Nightmare. The repressed, Cheryl not wanting to deal with Harry's death, as well as her queer identity, literally rising up in monstrous form to challenge the heteronormative hegemony of the town and its inhabitants. In the end, Cheryl needs to integrate these repressed aspects of herself into her daily life, something else that fits to a T with Wood's concept of modern horror. Oh, one last thing, it should be noted that the game was written by Sam Barlow. If that name sounds familiar, it's because his follow-up to Silent Hill Shattered Memories, not counting the cancelled Legacy of Kain Dark Sun, was 2015's indie hit Her Story. Her Story actually has a lot of themes in common with Silent Hill Shattered Memories, which I won't get into here, but let's just say that they're definitely noticeable. Silent Hill Shattered Memories is definitely a break from the traditions of the series, at least from a gameplay standpoint. However, themes of psychological horror, guilt, repression, and grief, longtime threads of the series, are present in force. While the controls aren't perfect, the same could be said for any game in the series, and the game is more concerned with the experience than the challenge, so it's not the hindrance one would expect. In the end, Silent Hill Shattered Memories is a worthy, but often woefully underlooked entry in the franchise, and definitely deserves, at the very least, a weekend rental.
Deep in the night, you think everything's right. Tell it to yourself. Say it's just a nightmare. Something is telling you.